Thank you very much, Eric. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening, and I'd immediately like to thank all of the fantastic team at M+ and Design Trust who have been incredible hosts and who have really allowed, kind of embarked on this adventure with us. Eric, Shirley, Marissa here from the board, Jahar, and Jennifer, Mimi, all of these wonderful hosts who have allowed us to spend a little bit of time here in this part of the world to continue, as Eric was pointing out, a project that began, I guess, more or less in 2012, around 2011, 2012, investigating a kind of a parallel dimension of design that certainly at the time was receiving relatively little interest in terms of the official or institutional frameworks of design, and that I think today is definitely gathered a lot of speed, but that in many ways is still deserving of observation. And the project that we proposed to the M+ Design Trust Fellowship is, the provisional title is Open Design Archipelago, which in a way was an attempt to kind of capture this idea of a certain understanding of design which is amorphous, that's difficult to describe in precise terms, that's also difficult maybe to frame within a kind of, especially from a Western perspective, within the history of design, and to step outside our own kind of the realm of what is familiar, to try to gain to kind of shift a little bit our perspective. And a lot of what we had worked on in the exhibition Adhocracy, also at Domus magazine, and in a small exhibition at Palazzo Clerici with Domus that was actually called Open Design Archipelago. It was kind of in a way the genesis of this project, was very much at the time associated with the field of the emergent field, or the by then fully emerging field of open source design that had kind of migrated from the realm of the immaterial, or was in the process of kind of increasingly materializing itself within the established economies of design, and beginning to look at how this, a lot of the principles, a lot of the ideas, a lot of the kind of dynamics that that it was possible to observe, that seemed new to us as Westerners, established, accustomed to a very normative and paradigm of design economies based on a very rigid understanding of intellectual property and copyright and authorship, was in many ways something that was extremely familiar elsewhere around the world. And so this project was an attempt to step outside this realm of the familiar, and to try to seek an alternative perspective, not necessarily with a kind of Orientalist perspective of coming to discover what design means in this part of the world, but more in many ways to actually understand ourselves, to understand some of the principles that wittingly or unwittingly underpinned our own understanding of design. So today, what I'd like to do is and I have here some. I should clarify, first of all, that being Open Design Archipelago, we've embarked on a project which is definitely open-ended, and so I'd like to immediately clarify that you're not going to get rid of us quite yet. We're going to be a while for an open-ended amount of time. Also, because I think we even ourselves we had really underestimated the complexity of what we were going to attempt. I must say, on the other hand, that this complexity has been rewarded amply, or the effort that's been put into kind of trying to confront this complexity, I think is certainly from our perspective bearing incredible fruits, and so we'd really like to persist and to insist on this line of research. And so what I'm going to show now today is in many ways a notes in progress. It's something that's unfinished, that's unpolished, and that's really in many ways more an invitation to open up a conversation, to really get your perspective as inhabitants of this region on what we're trying to do. And I'm going to structure it in the form of just reading out a few notes. It'll be in 3 parts. And it will, the presentation will be in 3 parts, and it'll be very subjective. These are things that I pulled together in the last days from a stack of notes, which is rather frighteningly thick, and that is in progress of, in the process of kind of evolving into something more structured, as is the film that we're working on, which is in parallel to the notes I have here on the page. There are some notes in visual form. But that in a way kind of offer a few points of reference or anchor points. One of the things that I'll say immediately about the film is that the intention of using film, which is something that in our practice, together with Martina, and in this instance with Zhang, who's been also working on the project and who's with us this evening, is an attempt in a way to shift a little bit of the discourse around design, which tends to be within our own kind of field, especially as design theorists and curators and even practitioners, somewhat devoid of any sort of discourse that confronts the question of the individual, of the human body, of the person, and so we wanted to, which is something we've done in a number of other projects as well, attempt to kind of shine a light on some of the contextual elements that surround the development of a certain design culture, from bringing in a certain kind of anthropological and perhaps even ethnographic perspective, in order to attempt to try to understand not simply the product in itself or the object in itself, but what kind of a condition produces that object, and what kind of effects the object that is the result of that is then in turn going to have on the context that surrounds it. So in that sense, pretty quickly we began to hone in on Huaqianbei, on the electronics marketplace in Shenzhen, as I guess as a kind of an avatar, or as a subject that responded to a certain fractal-like condition. Shenzhen and I should say the entire Pearl River Delta, as we just heard from Daniel and Juliana's presentation, has a long tradition in terms of its relationship with design and manufacturing and production. And of projecting that image out to the world, but and in many ways that's reflected within this kind of notion of a fractal within Shenzhen itself. And Shenzhen, in its own way, is in some ways its structure is captured by the neighborhood, the district of Huaqianbei. And within Huaqianbei, one can zoom in even further to a single building, which is Huaqian Mart. And even within that building, one can isolate a single floor and understand some of the dynamics that operate on a regional scale are reflected in that floor. And in this film we took, or in the kind of these initial notes towards a future film, we took an even smaller element, which was a cluster of what one could call a sub-neighborhood, a cluster of stalls within the ground floor of Huaqian Mart, which is actually simply a space of more or less 5 meters square, 5 by 5, so maybe, or 5 by 3, about 15 square meters. And everything you'll see in this film is, in a way, an emanation of that. It, in some way, is directly or indirectly connected. And I think as it plays out, you'll see a little bit more what these connections are. They're not immediate. They don't necessarily reveal themselves immediately. But we're interested in attempting to uncover some of this, the kind of the weaving of lives that produce what these objects that we use, that we are so familiar with, that we're kind of continually in contact with. And in turn, what kind of lives are produced by these objects, this kind of backwards and forwards, pushing and pulling. And in many ways, the first notes they had, how are we doing for time? I'm already. I wanted to just kind of offer a nod towards, yeah, maybe we could turn the lights up, perhaps, just in preparation for screening. An author who, in many ways, I think this project is indebted to is Joseph Needham, who is an individual who was primarily an academic who, yeah, that maybe I'll keep them on for the moment, thanks. My eyesight is not what it used to be. Joseph Needham, who made significant contributions to biochemistry and spent a long second act of his career writing multi-volume history of Chinese science and technology. In fact, Mackenzie Walk recently published a very interesting reflection on his life's work, in which he points out that he was born in 1900 and was therefore a close contemporary of Lacan, Lefebvre, Adorno, and so on. Son of musician and of surgeon. But the element that we're most interested in is when he was born in 1900, but in 1942, actually still in the midst of the Second World War, he flew over the hump to the Himalayas into China in an American aircraft and formed the idea of writing a book about Chinese science and technology and started taking notes for it. His first example was the grafting of plants. He observed a gardener in the grounds of the embassy performing such graft in a way that seemed different to Needham. On inquiry, the gardener told him that his method had been in use for hundreds of years. Needham became, among other things, an ethnographer of technique. He acquired an assistant, Huang Xingtung, with whom he traveled the length of breadth of nationalist-controlled China. As Winchester wrote, he was enabled to understand the country's culture and civilization without being constrained by the conventions of the type of people who in those days infested the country: the businessman, the missionary, the expatriate bureaucrat, and worst of all, the old China hand. He was also able to collect many Chinese books and manuscripts and arranged to have them shipped back to Cambridge offices via diplomatic bag. Needham traveled some 8,000 miles in an old truck converted to run on grain alcohol, equipped with all the necessaries, including apparently purposeless lengths of string and oilcloth and sheets of tin with which no self-respecting Englishman would travel anywhere remote. Besides meeting many Chinese scientists and scholars and visiting over 200 schools, he was able to form a picture of the great achievement of Chinese science and technology. China had a talent for design at all scales, from vast hydraulic projects, bridges and cities, grafting, the compass and the abacus. He also made contact with the Chinese Communist Party while in Chongqing, forming a lasting bond with several of its most prominent members, and the future premier of the People's Republic. After the end of the war, he took a job at the UNESCO, specifically handle the science portfolio. Needham began his life work in collaboration with Wang Ling, and in time also with Lu Guizheng, on many, many volumes of Science and Civilization in China. They covered everything from wrought iron to square pallet chain pumps, to tantric sex to suspension bridges to toilet paper, invented in China in the 6th century in the Common Era. As Winchester remarks, the books are about detail. George Steiner would eventually recognize literary achievement in addition to the scholarly one. It's a sort of remembrance of many, many things past, or a search for a very long stretch of lost time. The project performs at least two vital intellectual functions. Firstly, it decenters narratives about science, technology, the rise of modernity and all that, from the kind of narrative of from Plato to NATO, Eurocentric vision of design history. China was building vast, complex organizational forms while Europeans were still basically a bunch of goat herders. The other is that he was to ask, what became the Needham question? Why did Chinese ingenuity appear to dry up? So if I could have the lights, please. And the sound's coming out, the sound's coming out of the projector. still.
喂 ，Hello， 嗨，你有没有在工厂？之前那个网卡的那个819i 的819i CU 的那个，之前不是还有一些破损板子在你那里吗？对不对？有没有清掉？哦，那个我已经拍图片给你在微信上面，然后昨天那个芯片的包装我也有发给你，你看到没？HL008，HL，对，那个就是型号。对，其实它那个是代码型号的，如果是延迟的，我待会再再发给你。然后那个，然后我把那个图片也发给你，你到时候到工厂的时候帮我找一下看，看能不能找到一部分。然后它现在是，当时是要下4K，然后是不知道怎么搞，丢了怎么样，现在只有3K，现在差1K 多。因为当时是担心氧化了说贴出来效果不好嘛。现在就是说如果说你那边有找到的话，尽量把那个没有包装，就是没有破损的。没有破损的这些，对密封比较好的那种，就帮我发给他，但是我会把地址给你，好吧？好嘞，好嘞，好嘞，
145吗？144加48，100加2块啊，反正找。不好意思。
往哪儿去？再往哪儿？你这一号楼啥子的？
拿到没有了钱？这张不浪费时了吧？后面。哎呀！ 哎，我给做了小看我画的，看我怎么画你。不服气，不服，关我啥事儿啊？要画你的时候，你不服也得服。我没会画，我没会画。这样的是小明同学。这个是个鸡蛋，这是张白纸。我拿一张白纸，这是很重，真的是。穿上那个了，就是大头脸，脸不长，小气。
没有活力跟没，两年过的。毛的，人家感觉你是毛很多。然后搞啊，然后搞，肯定的，毛好多。你想说这种没肯定就是，哎，你开活力带还活力。
So that's the first of the first clip. I think due to I think we can have the lights back on. Actually, thank you. I don't think we'll have time to see all three, but just to kind of give you a little bit of insight into the structure that we're kind of interested in working with. The reason why I wanted to show this one at the beginning, which is very much there's nothing, it's not the kind of typical sort of product that one might be associate now with the kind of research that we're familiar with coming out of Huaqiangbei, some innovative gizmo or a gadget that does some insane miracle with LEDs. But it's something much more traditional and, in fact, just kind of reveal the secret at the end, what comes out at the other end of this kind of very laborious process of assembly, which is, by the way, entirely kind of flows through these 2 or 3 market stalls in Huaqian Mart, is actually a metal detector. It's one of those things that they use at airports for kind of scanning you down. So there's absolutely nothing interesting or revolutionary about it, but in many ways it kind of responds to this first point about the Needham question, what happened to ingenuity in China. And the way we were interested in addressing this was to kind of begin by telling the story of many of the industries that were first born here, which were simply an outsourcing, as we also saw before, of certain products that were previously made elsewhere, that are completely normal, that are simply, that it's simply possible to produce more cheaply within this ecosystem. But that was the necessary premise for actually answering that question. What happened to the ingenuity in China? What happened was essentially a fundamental transformation. And how many minutes do I have left? 3 minutes. We might be able to get... okay. We might be able to just have a one more point here, in which I guess the kind of the transitional point we wanted to go through was the idea of a certain kind of culture of approximation that's associated with design, or that for a very long time was associated with design and manufacturing. It sounds like we're in the factory right now. Maybe that manufacturing history hasn't completely come to an end. And one of the things that's interesting to observe is that in many ways this is a normal historical process. There's a normal historical process of transition that in 19th century Paris, Hamburg or New York, writers might have complained around of the shoddy quality of building work, and that a builder might not know one end of the trowel from another, or that plumbers might smash your pipes rather than mending them and so on. But that eventually a sense of craftsmanship returned when there was when a new economy established itself around a new set of products and a new set of principles. And in many ways, that is what we're interested in observing, coming here to observe, is the establishment of a completely new understanding of what a design economy might be. A design economy that's structured not less around the idea of a kind of a strict notion of ownership of ideas, of property of design, and so on, but more around flexibility and adaptivity to the market. The possibility of a factory being, rather than being set up as according to the Fordist model to produce millions of the same item, instead changing project on a daily basis, which is one of the later scenes that we observed was a factory which essentially is completely adaptive to the demands of the market on a daily basis, which I think in where we come from is something that's almost unthinkable. And so when one scales that up to the scale of a city like Shenzhen, and at the same time kind of takes into consideration the radically different, the other point that I'd like to make in relation to some of the scenes in these clips, was also the importance of understanding the kind of the broader cross-section of human life in relation to production, and the importance, for example, of children. Something that we've completely become unaccustomed to, the presence of children in the workplace, which is something of extraordinarily moving in Huaqiangbei. The seamlessness with which the working life of adults and the play of children are kind of sublimated into one. And that, in a way, is completely necessary for this, the degree of flexibility that this entire system has achieved. Its ability to respond through not necessarily simply a market-driven set of relations of kind of negotiations, but also a kind of an adaptivity that's only possible through direct human connections. And this is one of the things that's always extraordinary to observe in the marketplace. When one makes any kind of purchase, almost inevitably somebody will, that item will not be available there, but they'll disappear off into some other remote location, which may be a deposit, it may be even a competitor who's actually part of a sort of a mutual response, almost like the idea of a distributed store where the absence of stock in one place is compensated by stock arriving from elsewhere. And so one can think of Shenzhen in a way as a paradigm that's on the way to establishing, that's in kind of a transitional phase, that's on the way to establishing an original approach of its own. But that's infiltrating the system progressively, gradually, by making small alterations that, once they are established in the marketplace, become very difficult to resist, even for a heavily structured system like the one that we're accustomed to in the West. For example, another point I wanted to make was the interesting, the fact that right at this precise moment in many parts of the United States, for example, there are a number of right-to-repair bills which are currently making their way through, in fact, 8 states, Nebraska, New York, Tennessee, Wyoming, Minnesota, Kansas, Illinois, and Massachusetts, which would require electronics manufacturers to make repair parts and diagnostic and repair manuals available to independent repair professionals and consumers, not just authorized repair companies. Electronics right-to-repair legislation is modeled on 2012 Massachusetts law that preserved the right to repair cars. And the most logical reason, of course, for manufacturers to oppose the bill is that it would democratize the repair economy, making it possible for consumers to fix their own things and cutting into the profits of repairs done, for example, at the Apple Store. And right-to-repair bills in each state require manufacturers to provide software tools to bypass locks that prevent repair. And that is true on pretty much every level of the manufacturing of the marketplace of design, from telephones all the way up to John Deere tractors, which contain software that presents even basic repairs unless authorized by the company. And 2 years ago, a software update to iOS caused Apple's infamous Error 53, which bricked a number of iPhones that had been repaired by consumers or independent repair shops. So in many ways, while we're struggling with attempting to push through certain basic rights that one has to be able to repair and intervene on one's own products, not only in the name of a certain kind of right to repair, but also in the name of a certain kind of respect for the materials out of which these items are actually manufactured. That is something that has already been completely absorbed into the marketplace, that has been normalized, and that has actually come to support the marketplace by providing a certain critical mass in Huachuan Bay, which is not simply about the purchase and the consumption of new goods, but also about the carrying those goods through a full cycle, and potentially in a number of instances, a couple of which we managed to capture through multiple cycles, so even a process of disassembly and reabsorption into the manufacturing chain. And all of this kind of incredibly complex machine is on a continuous basis evolving, iterating, and increasingly implying completely new economies around the kind of products that it produces. And this is something that I think Obviously, it's very difficult to replicate something like Shenzhen, such a sophisticated and complex ecosystem. But increasingly, I think that there is not only a need, but also the interest, the desire to miniaturize many of these processes, to see how this paradigm could actually, to understand it as something that's not simply a kind of a way of getting around some of the contingent problems of this absence of an established marketplace as we understand it, but actually a paradigm that is at least 2 or 3 steps ahead of what we already have and what we already understand. And so in that sense, I think that a certain kind of the response to Needham's question of what happened to ingenuity in China, I think we're at the beginning of a new cycle of how can I say, cutting-edge innovation, which in many ways is increasingly implicit in the products that we use on a daily basis, and which we're no longer going to be able to resist for very long. And in many ways, obviously, a lot of this is already being studied, is already being discussed. But we're particularly interested, I think, in understanding the broader implications of that. What are the kind of ramifications within, also what are the effects on the city? How does this environment work as a kind of a complex machine, as a mechanism? And how is this something that we can actually learn from in terms of reconciling this absent presence of manufacturing, which has been delocated, has been kind of torn away from the places in which it actually ends up, and bringing the two back together on a maybe slightly smaller scale than Shenzhen or Huaqiangbei.